Welcome to Strip Cover Lit, where we squeeze the bigger picture out of literature. I am Adrian Ford, and we are here for part 3 of a 9-part series as we journey through What is Poetry by John Hall Wheelock. This, the third installment of which, is titled The Fourth Voice of Poetry. And to breach this chapter, I think it would probably be a good idea to start, as we have started most of this series, with the opening paragraph. In his situation of poetry, M. Maritain touches a profound truth when he describes a poem as a form of knowledge that is not ordered to knowing, but to being expressed in a work. Its aim, method, and end result is the creation of a new thing. That new thing represents a knowledge that could have been realized in no other way. In a universe in which everything has meaning, and in which all meanings are related and symbolize one another, the poet lives perpetually on the edge of discovery. As Walt Whitman said of himself, "I lie abstracted and hear beautiful tales of things and the reasons of things. They are so beautiful I nudge myself to listen." That is a pretty good mission statement for this chapter. Especially, I think, the quote, of poetry, that new thing represents a knowledge that could have been realized in no other way. And that quote in itself brings me to an Emily Dickinson poem that I think is pretty profound. If You Were Coming in the Fall. And If You Were Coming in the Fall reads as such. If you were coming in the fall, I'd brush the summer by, with half a smile and half a spurn, as housewives do a fly. If I could see you in a year, I'd wind the months in balls, and put them each in separate drawers, for fear the numbers fuse. If centuries delayed, I'd count them on my hand, subtracting till my fingers dropped into Van Diemen's land. If certain, when this life were out, that yours and mine should be, I'd toss it yonder like a rind, and take eternity. But, now uncertain of the length of this that is between, it goads me like a goblin bee, that will not state its sting. That is a profound and strange type of emotion which is represented here in a way which is represented at all in a way that I don't know that I ever would have realized how time feels different in certainty than in uncertainty, with a positive outcome waiting for you like this. I don't know that I ever would have been able to even verbalize that, let alone verbalize it, conceptualize it in such a brilliant fashion. Then we get something which is not so much a definition of poetry, and not even a rules manual for the poet, but something of a reverent observation of the thankless task, which, though it may be tertiary to the main thrust of this book, at least I'm hoping we get to the main thrust of this book eventually. We keep sort of tottering around the edges. Anyway, we get this passage on page 31. The poet, troubled by an awareness of something not fully understood, is impelled, implies Maritain, to the creation of a new thing that shall embody it, and thus reveal it to himself and, perhaps, to others. This new thing is the poem, a knowledge that without such embodiment would have remained a vague tantalization, an uncomfortable secret at the edge of consciousness. That there are, in every age, men and women compelled, one might say, to take upon themselves, in the face of all the ordinary, other, and quite sufficient difficulties of life, a task so thankless and so nearly impossible as that of giving a body to the bodiless essence of things, is proof of the almost obsessive power that the mystery of experience has over the human spirit. The mystery in which we are placed torments us, And the making of a poem is a bit of research, an effort to understand, a form of assuagement. I'm just going to read that one again, because I think that that is a powerful, powerful passage when trying to understand. It is often said of writers, by writers, which you can never believe. It is often said that being a writer is not something that you do. It's something that you can do nothing else if you don't. So much in the same way that a dog gets very, very nasty if you don't feed it, a writer gets very, very nasty if he or she cannot write. It is something that roils under your flesh. If you are the writer, you must do that. Even if there is no prize there for you, even if it is something. Many writers don't even write in the fictional form or the poetic form. There are many people who write in journals, and they have to write in that fashion. It is something that compels them. They have no other choice. But I would like to read this passage again with that idea as illumination. The poet, troubled by an awareness of something not fully understood, is impelled, implies Maritain, to the creation of a new thing that shall embody it, and thus reveal it to himself and perhaps to others. This new thing is the poem, a knowledge that without such embodiment would have remained a vague tantalization, an uncomfortable secret at the edge of consciousness. There are in every age men and women compelled, one might say, to take upon themselves, in the face of all the ordinary, other, and quite sufficient difficulties of life, a task so thankless and so nearly impossible as that of giving a body to the bodiless essence of things, is proof of the almost obsessive power that the mystery of experience has over the human spirit. The mystery in which we are placed torments us. The making of a poem is a bit of research, an effort to understand, a form of assuagement. That is powerful. I think that is well done, even if it is tertiary to what should be considered the main thrust of this work, judging simply from the title. We do get to the chapter title on the next page, and it comes to us from T.S. Eliot. It is a T.S. Eliot reference, that is to say, the fourth voice of poetry. And the paragraph reads as such: the three voices, according to Mr. Eliot, may be defined as follows: the voice of the poet talking to himself or to nobody, directly expressing the poet's own thoughts and sentiments; the voice of the poet addressing an audience, whether large or small, in poetry intended to amuse or instruct, poetry that tells a story, poetry that preaches or points a moral; and lastly, the voice of the poet when he attempts to create a dramatic character, speaking in verse, when he is saying not what he would say in his own person, but only what he can say within the limits of one imaginary character, addressing another imaginary character. Eliot makes it clear that these distinctions are tentative. There could be fewer or still other categories. He points out, moreover, that the three voices are not mutually exclusive, but are often found together. The first and the second in non-dramatic poetry, and together with the third in dramatic poetry too. That there you will sometimes hear the voice of the author and the voice of his character speaking as one voice. Finally, Eliot goes on to say, there are lines in a play by one of the supreme poetic dramatists in which we hear a more personal voice still than that of either the character or the author. And I think that the vapid and backtracking nature of the second half of this paragraph accurately reflects on T.S. Eliot's work. Moving on. We get some terrible mishmash writing for a little while in this chapter, and then we get another gem coming to us from Wheelock. On 33, and yet there are lines and passages in poems of every description that readers of varying degrees of perceptivity, different points of view, and opposite temperaments have almost unanimously singled out over the generations, despite all the changes in literary taste and fashion, as especially noteworthy lines where the voice, not the poet's, yet issuing from him, speaks with an authority and a finality that compel acceptance. These are the lines and passages that intuition tells us have not been invented so much as discovered. And I think that that is a great way to sort of summarize what it feels like to happen upon a gram of literature which is revelatory to the individual. But I would leave it at that. I would not say that they have not been invented so much as discovered. I would say that invention involves a great deal of discovery, and I will have a beef with this coming later in this very chapter. But Wheelock continues from here by giving us many examples of what he considers the fourth voice of poetry, the voice that encompasses the timeless. And really, what I take from the examples he gives is that much of this is to do with subversion of expectation. And fair enough. Subversion of expectation, though, is not discovery. Subversion of expectation is a very difficult part of the craft of writing because it involves accurate diagnosis of expectation. And it is only from an accurate diagnosis of expectation that those expectations might be subverted. And it is the subversion of expectation that really riles the reader into a different point of view. And for this fourth voice of poetry, the timeless lines, it jostles the reader into a different point of acceptance. So that is why I have a problem with this. Yet no art, however disciplined, can so order words as to create the illusion of that seemingly accidental inevitability with which they fall into place when something beyond art is speaking. After all, words are not playthings. In the highest sense, they are not even tools, but the outward evidence of an inner reality. The visitations of what have called the fourth voice of poetry are not to be commanded. Certainly, it is the voice for which every poet waits. The long, lonely labor of self-discipline are his prayer that he may be an instrument worthy of that voice if it should come to him, to speak through him the words and the wisdom that are somehow beyond his scope, his own scope and clairvoyance. It is this conjunction of almost more than mortal longing and the stars that alone makes possible for the transcendent revelation. Pure rubbish. Utter garbage. The mind is something that works very much like the rest of the body, like a muscle. It does things that it is trained to do. So that the writer that has so conditioned his or herself to write in such a way that transcendence might come from those words. That is, he or she is very skilled, very practiced, has put much effort into the craft. That is when he or she might be rewarded with these fourth voice of poetry type lines. They are not an act of God. They are not something which is sprinkled upon him or her. And sure, he or she might not know from whence they sprung, but that does not mean that they came from on high. It means that much in the same way that someone who is an Olympic level weightlifter can sit down and push up a weight which is 50% of his or her max in a way that is just utterly fascinating to watch. This is the same way that a writer can do these things because his or her mind is trained to do them. Sometimes there's just a little more weight on the bar than we realized at first. So we're pushing something heavier than we knew we were pushing. To suggest, where's the line? No art, however disciplined, can so order words as to create the illusion of that seemingly accidental inevitability with which they fall into place when something beyond art is speaking, is rubbish. It's garbage. It's stupidity. How then do we have the volumes of Shakespeare? How then did Hemingway spring into existence? How then does a novel of such import happen? They don't just happen. They are worked at. And first off, the artist might not know. This is where I was going earlier with the Olympic weightlifter analogy. The artist might not know from whence that great well of strength sprung. When all of a sudden, you'll hear this from an athlete. I had been bench pressing 225 for so long and I just couldn't get over it. And then within the matter of a month, I was bench pressing 300 pounds. For years, I couldn't get past 225. Then in a month's time, I made 75 pounds of progress. It's not magic. It simply isn't. It's that a well broke and it happened, or a dam broke and it happened. So to suggest that these things are mysterious might be one thing. To suggest that we have no control over them is quite another. And it is a huge step, and it is awfully presumptuous, and it is, dare I say, a very stupid thing to say or even to suggest. But pretend that the artist has no idea from whence these things sprung. Fine. If that's what the artist tells you, that's what the artist tells you. But everyone knows you should not listen to an artist when it comes to his or her own work. They are simply unreliable sources of knowledge. So these great lines that are represented here in this text that are cited as being that fourth voice of poetry. When old age shall this generation waste, thou shalt remain in midst of no other woe than ours. Heard melodies are sweet, but those unheard are sweeter. A sun, a shadow of a magnitude. These lines, the writer will almost undoubtedly tell you, I have no idea how that happened. While knowing, boy, that line there, I worked for days to get that right. So I just don't buy it. I don't buy the mysticism of the fourth voice of poetry. But that is all that I have time for in this installment of What is Poetry? This has been part 3 of a 9-part series, The Fourth Voice of Poetry. I hope to see you back next time for part 4, which is The Poem in the Nuclear Age, which is a very promising chapter title. If you like this sort of thing, it really helps us out here on the channel if you hit that like button. I would love to hear your thoughts on the things discussed in this video in the comments section below. If you are looking forward to joining us as we journey through this book, What is Poetry by John Hall Wheelock, make sure you subscribe, and if you have not, maybe hit the bell button as well, because we're going to get through this thing. And if you'd like to help us create more content here on Strip Cover Lit, there is, as always, a link to our Patreon to be found in the description below.